Greetings! Bluetti has decided to enter the ever-expanding DIY solar inverter market with an entry of their own called the RV5 Power Hub, a dual MPPT 5 kilowatt inverter charger meant for install in an RV, van, boat, or off-grid system that can be paired to any 48-volt battery of your choice. Of course, they are offering their own IP65 water-resistant and heated 100 amp-hour batteries to pair with the inverter that effortlessly shares BMS battery data right out of the box. It seems like a pretty interesting and very bold product for Bluetti, but is it any good? Let's find out.
HOBOTECH.
For those new to DIY battery and solar inverter systems, you're going to need a briefing of what the RV5 inverter and B4810 battery, that's what this is called, combo actually does and why it exists. What you're basically seeing here is a 5,000 watt solar generator with a 5 kilowatt hour battery that is split into two parts. This lets you install the inverter part in a dry location close to your breaker and fuse box, as this is not outdoor rated, while installing the sealed and heated batteries in a separate wet or cold environment. And since the batteries are modular, you can install as many as you have room for, up to 24 batteries. The batteries and inverter communicate with each other through a single Ethernet data cable, and you can install an optional screen in a different location for remote monitoring. Essentially, it lets you build a bigger system in a smaller, more limited environment. The RV5 Power Hub inverter holds the brains, 2 MPPT solar controllers, the 5,000 watt AC inverter, which also doubles as the battery charger, and something unusual for an off-grid inverter, a dedicated 100 amp 12 volt regulated DC output. Also unusual since this is designed to be used either as an off-grid home inverter or an inverter charger in a vehicle. One of the 2 MPPT controllers can be switched into a different mode from solar PV to vehicle to allow 12 or 24 volt alternator or external battery bank charging. This leaves 1 MPPT free for solar use up to 1800 watts of panels. Now, for those of you that already own B300 series batteries, you can get adapters from Bluetti that will let you pair those with the RV5 inverter instead, so you don't have to buy these new batteries at all. They also have these new smaller 12 volt heated IP65 rated batteries you can wire in series for 48 volts if you can't fit one of these large single 5 kilowatt hour batteries in the space you already have. I suggest if you're curious about the installation procedure and all the options available that you just download the user manual from Bluetti's website for all the gory details. I'll have a link to that in the description of this video. Now on to the specs. The B4810 LFP batteries are 51.2 volt 100 amp hour for 5,120 watt hours each, and as previously mentioned are heated and IP65 water resistant for placing outdoors or in an uninsulated compartment. They have a 100 amp BMS on board and are rated for 6,000 cycles. They're approximately 101 pounds each and are about 24 by 15 by 6 inches. Now, as for the RV5 Power Hub, as they call it, it's rated at 5,000 watts, both for inverting and battery charging. It can be AC charged with either 120 or 240 volt split AC, or from a level 2 EV charger per the manual. The inverter, however, only outputs 120 volts. There is no parallel option to output 240 volt split. I'll say that again, there is no 240 volt split phase output support on this product. This isn't something you need anyway in an RV or van build, but those thinking about possibly using this for a home inverter unit needs to be aware of that limitation. This is why in the marketing they state it's good for cabins and RVs and yachts without ever mentioning the word home anywhere. Note that there are no built-in plugs, sockets, or outlets. You get bare wire terminals that you need to screw wires into either their E-panel breaker box, which I'm not going to show in this video, or into your own breaker box or set of outlets. So be aware you do need to hardwire all AC and DC connections yourself. The package you buy will determine how many pre-crimped cables you receive in the kit. The RV5 inverter unit is quite small and light for its size, being approximately 20 by 18 by 6 inches and around 30 pounds. It can be either wall or floor mounted, but does have to be mounted upright like you see here so that cold air flows up through the bottom and out of the top. The only built-in display is on the RV5 inverter, and as you can see, it is very small. It's a basic display ripped from a mid-sized Bluetti product that shows all the standard data. Even these buttons are recycled from the Bluetti parts bin. The buttons do light up when pressed, and both Bluetooth and Wi-Fi is built in and can be manually disabled if you prefer. You can obviously fully control the unit from a remote app if you desire, but they also offer an add-on product called the ePad. That's what you see right here, which is basically a large touchscreen tablet that you can mount at your choice of location via its included lengthy Ethernet cable. The pad is powered via that Ethernet cable, so you don't have to run separate power into it, although it does accept separate power through USB, and that's how I'm powering it right now with a hidden power bank behind it. I do strongly suggest you opt for this add-on, as it gives you full control over the unit without the need for a wireless connection, and it can track additional sensors such as fresh water and other things in your RV. Now, as for ways to charge, you have the option to charge via solar, AC grid or generator, EV charging station with an adapter, and via 12 or 24 volt alternator. The two MPPT controllers aboard support 12 to 50 volts at 50 amps each. Yes, only 12 to 50 volts, but at an insane 50 amps. Enough to liquefy a standard 30 amp MC4 solar panel connector. So with enough big cables going to enough Y adapters to enough recommended Bluetti 200 watt solar panels running at just the right voltage, you can almost manage 3,600 watts of total solar input. In the real world, you're never going to see that. Now let's assume the stars did align. 3,600 watts of solar could charge a single 5 kilowatt B4810 battery in about an hour and a half. And if you want an alternator charge, you can switch the second solar input into 12-24 volt mode and charge at a maximum of 600 watts at 12 volts or 1200 watts at 24 volts for topping up the same battery in about 9 hours or 4.5 hours respectively. As for AC charging, you can take full advantage of 50 amp hookups at RV parks or boat docks and charge at either 120 or 240 volt split phase at up to 42 amps or 5,000 watts. At that rate, you can top up this battery in just over 1 hour. Now, as for 12 volt outputs, this is where the Bluetti inverter does something you won't find on many other DIY off-grid inverters. They offer a honkin' 100 amp 12 volt DC output regulated at a unique 13.8 volts. This means almost 1,400 watts of DC output support at 12 volts and over 60 amps or 1,600 watts when switched to a 24 volt mode. This of course requires some seriously beefy cables, but it does mean you can literally power every 12 or 24 volt DC appliance in your RV, boat, or off-grid cabin. Sweet. As for the warranty, there is a 5-year manufacturer's warranty on both the RV5 and B4810 components, as well as the 12 volt battery. Of course, I took the RV5 and B4810 battery here into my secret lab where I performed all kinds of crazy experiments on it. First, let's show you the ins and outs of the RV5. Okay, so these are your two PV inputs. You have PV1 and PV2. You have to put raw crimped cables into this. You cannot use any kind of connectors. Here's your temperature sensor, your battery pack communications cable. This is the EMS port, whatever that does. So this goes to your ePad, as they call it. Here is where your DC output is. This is a 100 amp 12 volt output. I have that running to an inverter, so I'm going to go ahead and test that output here shortly. Here is your AC output. You can see it's 120 volts only. You got line, neutral, and ground, and that's up to 5,000 watts. This is your AC grid in. Now this supports 120 or 240 volt charging, so it depends on how you want to set it up. You can add in line 2, then in the app you can change it to 240 volts. I have it set at 120 volt charging. Here's your main battery cables. They gave you the correct gauge for the amount of amps, which is good, so you have just one set of inputs for your battery. And these are supposed to clamp down onto the cables. So up here you have your screen, which weirdly you can't really see head on, but only at an angle, I guess because they expect you to mount to a wall. You have your typical Bluetti buttons, your power button, your AC and DC, so you can turn those on individually or through the app, or you can control the whole system through the ePad. Now quick look at the 48 volt battery. You have your positive, your negative terminal, you have your output for your data cable that goes to the inverter, and I believe that's a pass-through, so if you want to pass data through one port to the other, you could do that. This is the pressure release, because this is a sealed battery. It is pressurized from the factory to keep liquids and everything out. So here's your main power button for the battery. If I press that, it turns it off and turns it back on. That's all there is to the battery. It's very simple. As for the ePad, it has everything on there you would expect it to. Be able to control AC, DC, They do have sensors if you want to buy them that will monitor your fresh water tank levels in your RV. You see, you have solar input here, AC input there, output there. Tells you the percentage of your battery, which is currently 49%, how long you have to go. Then you have your settings screens for your different smart plugs and liquid levels and stuff like that if you want to hook that stuff up. You can sign up for Bluetti's service that will monitor your batteries and stuff for you through the cloud. I don't do cloud stuff, so I could decline that. And then you have things like your screen timeout, the sleep time, so you can have this thing stay on all the time, or you can have it fall asleep on you if you like. You can control the brightness of the screen, stated charge limits, so the load will shut off if the batteries get to a certain level. It does have Bluetti's extreme weather alert, so it will automatically enter emergency backup mode if it receives a disaster warning. Then you got your firmware section, your update section, restart, then what they call pro mode, which you can set up sleep timers, set up your inverter output frequency, sleep mode. Then the last screen is be all the serial numbers and stuff, which I'm not going to show. And that's all there is to the ePad. As for the results of the AC battery capacity test, it scored an even 4,300 watt hours out of 5,120 for 84%. Now this is on the low side of average. I actually ran this test twice to verify, and this was the actual better of the two results after 2 full cycles of the battery. I need to state that this test was done between 0.2 and 0.25 C discharge rate of the battery, so the results that I do are consistent across all brands and capacities, and this is how manufacturers rate the cells, so it should be an accurate result. Now here's what's interesting. Since the battery is separate from the inverter, we can actually measure to the 10th of an amp how much power the battery itself drained during this test, and the results were shocking. And was the real reason I ran this test twice because I just couldn't believe the first results I got. My first result, according to the Victron monitor between the battery and inverter, showed around 86 amp hours out of an expected 100. 85, 87, that's still no good. I wrote that off as a bogus result due to it being the first full cycle of the battery, so I cycled the battery again, ran it after a full recharge. The second result got 88.5 amp hours out of 100, and 4.6 out of 5.1 kilowatt hours of usable capacity. Note that I scored 4.3 kilowatt hours running the inverter, and 4.6 kilowatt hours actually came out of the battery. That means the inverter only wasted about 300 watt hours, or around 6% of the usable capacity during that test, which is actually quite good. So one of two things are happening. Either Bluetti is fibbing about the capacity of this battery, or they're being extremely conservative with the BMS settings, and it is saving 11.5% of the battery in reserve. So in other words, it's not discharging all the way. Now I'm going to assume by the weight of the battery that it does contain at least 100 amp hours of cells, and that Bluetti is just being very conservative. After all, you don't really want the battery to drain to absolute zero anyway, because then you couldn't turn it back on remotely via this or the pad. And this is just my own educated guess. In my personal opinion, it's too conservative of a setting. They should really only be holding about 5% reserve, or they could have simply oversized the pack a little bit to get a usable 100 amp hours. Every other 48 volt rack style battery I've ever tested after 2 full cycles has scored at least 100 amp hours in this test. So before anyone tries to blame the Victron shunt, I've tested every battery on this channel with it, and I've even done offline testing with a lab calibrated tester. It's always within about 1.5% accurate. Note that in the screenshot of the Victron results, it only discharged down to 49.2 volts. This tells me they're only using about the center 80% or so of the battery, and that is probably already oversized. But in any case, those are the results of the best 2 runs, and oversized or not, you're only getting about 89% of the available capacity of the battery. And because we have a Victron shunt with battery monitor installed between the battery and inverter itself, we don't need to perform any idle consumption time lapses to guess what the power consumption is. We can simply measure it directly through the Victron as we turn features on and off on the Bluetti. So let's check that out. So for once, we actually can separate the battery from the rest of the system, and that means I can install a Victron shunt in between the battery and the inverter, which I have it right here. It is inline in the negative battery terminal, so it measures the exact wattage that this pulls under any situation. Now, to prove to everyone watching, when the inverter is turned off, there is 0 watts. Now, that's what you would expect. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the battery, which turns on the inverter. Nothing else is on. I have the screen disconnected. The only thing powered on is the system itself. That means it's going to have a Wi-Fi and Bluetooth on, the communications to the battery, and the little tiny screen up here. You can see there it only consumes 6 watts turned on, which is not bad. Let's see by plugging in that flat panel monitor how much more power it takes. So remember, we're at 6 watts right now. So once it's booted up and settled, it now uses 12 watts. So it doubles the idle consumption. So far we learned that turning the system on is 6 watts. And then when you turn on the screen, that's another 6 watts. Let's turn on DC. So DC consumption, now this is DC turned on only without the monitor, is 10 watts. So it's additional 4 watts to turn on the DC circuitry. Now let's go ahead and turn off DC. Drops back down to 6. Turn on AC. Now this is going to be the big one. Now it does constantly bounce back and forth between like 16 and 19. It seems to hover around 18 the most. So we're going to call idle consumption 18 watts. That's for the AC inverter only. So let's turn on AC and DC at the same time. You can see now we're up to about 21 watts of idle consumption. Now let's go ahead and add the screen back. This would be the maximum amount of consumption that you could expect if you have all these products turned on and enabled at the same time. We're up to about 27, 28 watts. We'll call it 28 watts of idle consumption. That's for everything being turned on, including the monitor down here. So to summarize the results, it's 6 watts to power the unit on, 12 watts if using the ePad, 18 watts if using just the AC inverter, 10 watts if using just the DC side, 22 watts if you turn on both AC and DC, and 28 watts if you turn everything on and include the ePad. So let's rate the idle run times for these scenarios, assuming a single 4810 battery has 4.6 kilowatt hours of usable capacity. So the unit just powered on with nothing else, a single 4810 battery would run the RV5 for about 32 days before dying, and that's excellent. If we add in just the DC side, that drops the runtime down to 19 days. If we had both AC and DC, then it'll run about 8.5 days. At max, with the whole shebang, including the D-pad screen, it will live for about a week before dying. These numbers are all very good. In fact, I was surprised Bluetti managed only 18 watts of AC idle consumption for a 5,000 watt inverter, and that makes me wonder why the rest of their product line can't do better. I'm always asked how long stuff will run on these products, compensating for usable capacity, which we just figured out. You can pause this chart. I'm going to put up on screen. Tell you approximately how long common appliance will run on this unit. That assumes one B4810 battery. Double these numbers for 2 batteries, triple for 3, so on and so forth. I want to show you what this monstrosity looks like before I get started now. I'm using some of the cables they provided. Some of these are ones they provided with the system. So here's a giant roll of cables that comes with to hook it up to various things. Here's what they call the quick start guide. Yeah, look at that. Anybody who looks at that, their head's gonna spin and explode if you've never seen a system like this before. So the quick start kit tells you how to mount the solar panels, tells you that you need to run multiple glands because you have to run all the solar panels in parallel. That explains more up here. If you want to hook it up to your RV alternator, you use one of the PV inputs for the alternator, the other is for 4 solar panels. So you can't have all the solar panels and hook it to your alternator. You have to do one or the other. So second system here is off-grid, where you can do 8 solar panels. This shows you how you can pile up and stack the batteries. This shows you all the stuff that comes with the batteries. Each one of these kits are separate kits you can buy. Then there's switches and stuff. There's just a lot to this. It tells you all the tools you need, including what I find the most hilarious thing I've seen in all these instructions. You can see right here it says an electric chainsaw is required for installation. Now, that's a first. And then, of course, it comes with its own manual, which you would think it would be a lot thicker than that for something this complicated, but it is not. It is pretty basic, gives you the very basic stuff. Anyway, let's start the testing. Sine wave check under load, we scored 120 volts, 60 hertz, that's a pass. Inverter capacity test at maximum load, we're able to pull 6,400 watts for 5 seconds, that's a pass. Cooling ability heat soak test, I ran this test 3 times, first time at 5,000 watts, second at 4,900, third at 4,800. Now I was only able to make it the full 5 minutes at 4,800 watts, likely due to only having 1 battery attached. Bluetti says in the user manual that 2 batteries are required for sustained 5 kilowatt rates. So I'm going to still consider this a pass since the limitation was mentioned in the manual. As for inverter fan noise at the 5,000 watt max rate, it's certainly not quiet, but it's not loud either. It kind of sounds like a box fan running. It scored 55 decibels from 1 meter away. The max charge rate AC on turbo, which is rated up to 5,000 watts, I was able to hit a maximum of 4,600 watts. At standard mode, it charged at 2,000 watts, and on quiet mode, 1,200. Now, the claimed DC solar input MPPT range is 12 to 50 volts, 50 amps, 1,800 watts times 2, so you double that for 3,600 watts. Now, as tested, I was able to push in 50 volts exactly at 2,000 watts, limited by the equipment because finding a 50 volt 50 amp charger is like finding unicorn turds on eBay. I think it'll be just as hard to find the perfect combo of small solar panels in parallel to get anywhere near the 3,600 watt cap. Now, as for the charging fan noise, at AC maximum 5,000 watt rate was 54 decibels, or about the same as the inverter level at maximum. At AC minimum or quiet mode was a much quieter 44 decibels. Simultaneous charging ability is supported up to the solar maximum, or as I tested, 2,000 watts, solar priority. As for the 240 volt charging ability, it is possible, but I did not test it. You do have to switch it in the app. This does actually support a UPS backup feature and is claimed 20 millisecond switchover time. The most controversial test on all the interwebs, the UPS or uninterruptible power supply test. This is where we figure out if lightning strikes, the power goes out, will the inverter in this switch over fast enough to keep your electronics, in this case a full-size Dell computer running. We got a music video playing at 1080p, full screen. It's pulling just over 100 watts. You might be able to see the screen over here. As soon as I press this button, it's going to cut off the wall power, and we're going to see, does it switch over fast enough to keep the PC running? Place your bets. 3, 2, 1. Of course, it does work. I would expect it to. If it didn't work, this thing would be going right into the dumpster. Let's turn it back on. Make sure that if the power comes back on, it recovers, no problem. We go off and on a bunch of times. Music video still rocking. That's a big pass. DC output max rate. The DC output is rated at 100 amps at 13.6 volts or 1,360 watts. I ran it at 5 minutes at 1,200 watts because I couldn't push my inverter any harder. 12 volt output is regulated at 13.8 volts. That voltage does dip a little bit as you ramp up the power. Musician's favorite amp interference test. This is where we determine is the amp clean or dirty. Meaning, can you run amplifiers, PA systems, ham radios and stuff off the inverter in here? Because if you had this running your small cabin or your RV, you want to throw a big party, PA speakers, you want to rock out on a guitar or something, you want to know are you going to get a lot of buzz out of the speakers? And you also can't have that if you're doing ham radio. So all I got to do is turn the AC inverter on. We'll find out. Place your bets. That is whisper quiet, absolute pass. EMF test is where we figure out how much interference does this thing give off. So right now I do have it turned on, screen on. It has the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi enabled, and we're only reading about 1 or 2, which is fantastic. Let's go ahead and put on DC, see what happens. Wow, that's really low. Let's try the AC inverter. That's usually where it really bumps up. Hear the click, needle goes up, and then goes back down. So we're only registering about 8. 6, 10, 8. So we're only registering about 8 with the inverter on. That is incredible. Yeah, we're not even getting a beep. That is fantastic. Bluetti, you did a great job shielding this inverter. That means if you have a pacemaker or you're in a situation where you cannot have electromagnetic interference in your environment, like say you're doing radio work, stuff like that, that makes this a very fantastic and clean inverter for use in those scenarios. So all results fell within expectations except the battery capacity is artificially limited to 88.5 amp hours in the battery instead of 100 amp hours as advertised. Also, MPPT averages on the RV5 unit are 50 amps and are so high as to be unsafe at the 50 amp 1800 watt maximum unless all PV wiring connectors and branch connectors are 6 gauge or larger and rated for at least 50 amp. Installers need to be very aware of this limitation. So what do I think about the RV5? Everyone knows the saying, better late than never, but sometimes it should be reversed to say better never than late. And that is especially true when it comes to releasing tech products. If you're the last one to the party, your entry better either be major market changing or McDonald's priced. Otherwise, you make a fool of yourself and potentially bankrupt your company. So listen to what I have to say next, and you can decide if Bluetti maybe made a mistake releasing this product, or maybe they actually hit it out of the ballpark. There is a case for both depending on how you look at it. Okay, first I have to ask, how much of a market is there in 2025 for a DIY RV kit? It's pretty niche, as most folks go the traditional way of installing separate batteries, MPPT, inverter, and solar panels either themselves or they outsource to a solar installer. Virtually no licensed installer is going to install any third-party equipment like this due to liability, simply not being familiar with it. And they're also going to want to profit on selling you said gear at a fat markup. So this means if you get the RV5 kit, it's going to be you and or a friend paid with pizza and or beer to do the entire install, at least all the parts below the solar panels. So if you're comfortable with that and it's in your wheelhouse, then this is probably a nothing burger. Second, there have been such kits on the market for at least 5 years now. EcoFlow had probably the best one on the market 3 years ago, and it sold so poorly that they barely wasted any marketing dollars promoting the thing, and then they ended up pawning it off to a third-party van lifer type website to deal with. The EcoFlow out of the box supported 12 to 150 volts of solar through a pair of MPPTs, had a third dedicated input for alternator or low PV charging up to 60 volts. So when I saw the specs for the RV5, I immediately confronted Bluetti about the ridiculously low 50 volt limit on their MPPTs. They straight up told me that they looked at the manual for the EcoFlow power kit and saw it had a 60 volt limit. And they decided on a 50 volt limit to meet UL 1741 requirements. And as a person who has lots and lots of Victron equipment, I went to Victron's website, looked up their actual UL 1741 certificate for their 250 volt solar MPPT controllers. I sent that to Bluetti, and they replied, overall system does not fully comply with safety certification requirements. Now take note of that last sentence. Bluetti is trying to say that Victron, who has an actual downloadable UL 1741 certificate from 2020 for all of their high voltage MPPT controllers, is not fully compliant with safety certification requirements. In other words, they have much better weed in China than they do in the Netherlands, where Victron is based, and I find that really hard to believe. And to prove to you that I'm just not making this stuff up, here's an actual screenshot from the multi-page letter I received as a response. So essentially, Bluetti copied what they thought were EcoFlow's 60 volt specs for their product, specs that were never updated from the beta test 3 years ago, and they just ran with that. See, I own the EcoFlow power kit. I had it from release day, and I used it to power my RV off-grid for a full month, running 4 320-watt Renogy 40-volt VOC panels in series, so don't tell me it doesn't support 150 volts. EcoFlow told me those MPPT controllers did support 150 volts, and what was in the manual was basically a typo. So Bluetti copies the incorrect voltage specs from EcoFlow to build their own product 3 years later to run at a higher 50 amps, instead of EcoFlow's paltry but much safer 30 amps, thinking they're in for the win here by having a higher amp limit. And when I explained to them that 50 amps would melt a 30 amp MC4 connector, they said they expect users to run 6-gauge cables and Y-branch adapters to get it down to 25 amps, run multiple cables through glands in your roof to solve that problem, and that panels in parallel are better for shading. Yes, every monkey on the planet knows panels in parallel are better for shading, but when you have a 50 volt battery bank and a 50 volt MPPT controller, you run into a serious problem, and that is MPPT controllers thrive on higher voltage. In order for them to work properly and efficiently, you need a much higher voltage on the solar than the battery voltage. There's actually a calculation for it to figure out the prime voltage range that you should aim for when using an MPPT controller. If low voltage and high amps was the key to efficiency, then why does every home inverter on the market support 150, 250, 500 or more volts of solar at under 30 amps. My $6,000 home inverter that's in the next room running my house with 15,000 watts of MPPT supports 500 volts of solar at 20 amps, not 50 volts at 200 amps. Anyway, I blinded them with science. Funny enough, Bluetti now actually has a real solution for this limitation, and that is their new Solar X4K product, and that's compatible with the RV5 inverter. Now that product supports 150 to 500 volts of MPPT, or in other words, normal, up to 4,000 watts. That box converts that down to the 50 volts, 50 amps that the RV5 can use. The downside, it's $700. So yep, you can certainly use those 400 watt residential panels on your RV roof with the RV5 for the low price of only $699. And that's on top of the price of the kit itself. So besides the solar limits, I was kind of miffed when I only got 88.5 amp hours out of this battery. The first time I tested it, it completely shut down at the end. The second time it didn't. However, the RV5 on its screen said 0%, wouldn't let me turn anything on. While there was still juice left in the battery, it was inaccessible, so it just may as well not exist. Seeing how every other 48 volt 100 amp hour battery on the market I've tested meets or exceed 100 amp hours, I'm crying foul. Maybe I have a bad battery. Maybe Mercury was in retrograde during testing. In any case, boo. Last and least, if they're going to copy EcoFlow's power kit, they should have also copied the easy single-click connectors for all the IOs on that unit. Their batteries had prefab cables with no exposed terminals, one click to install. All the MPPTs had plug-in connectors, even the AC in and out, DC in and out used plug-in connectors. You can't screw that up. Each plug only fits into one place. Yes, they're proprietary connectors, but if you're trying to sell a super easy to install DIY kit in a mobile vehicle, the less wire stripping and crimping and accidentally missing out cables or worse polarity during an install, the better. The EcoFlow for me was a no-brainer to install that I really couldn't mess up. Of course, it was stupid expensive, well beyond the price of several of these. So it's almost an apple to oranges comparison. However, with the Bluetti, I could easily see a normal non-professor hobo type sticking a bare wire in the wrong place or mixing up polarity somewhere to cause at best a blown fuse, at worst a fire, and a Bluetti warranty claim. You really need to be comfortable with clamping down bare wires, hooking up red wires to positive, black wires to negative, not mixing things up like line and neutral to AC power, especially if you plan to plug it into an external AC source. Getting those backwards can cause you to get electrocuted. This is where I think Bluetti kind of dropped the ball on this product, because it's really no easier to install than a basic EG4 inverter and 5 kilowatt hour server rack battery in an RV. Yeah, you definitely get some better mounting options here. Yes, you get IP65 heated batteries, which could be a big deal for those that winter camp in Montana. Yes, you get what's certainly a better app experience with Bluetti, especially with that optional ePad screen. Probably the hottest feature for mobile users that you don't get elsewhere. You get that 100 amp DC output to run into a fuse box. And yeah, you get that 5-year Bluetti warranty on top of it. Yes, these features all come at a premium. And that brings us to our favorite place, product price. Okay, I'm just going to rant off the prices currently available on Bluetti's site as of November 9th, 2025. I'll be sure to add the discount codes, if any, to the description. Therefore, the prices I'm about to mention do not include any additional discounts. The current sale price for the RV5 unit by itself is $1299. And I think that's a pretty competitive price on the DIY market because it competes directly with the $1,600 EG4 6000 XP. Now, the EG4 does support 240 volt split right out of the box and 8,000 watts of high voltage solar, but it's also significantly larger, almost double the weight, and louder at 58 decibels, all of which could be an issue in a mobile environment with limited space. It's also going to consume a lot more power at idle, up to 50 watts compared to the Bluetti, which is about half of that if you're using everything. Now, I know many watching were planning on spamming in the comments how much better EG4 is, and maybe that's true for an off-grid residential inverter with a huge battery bank and a large room like this where roaring fans are fine and a 50-watt idle consumption is perfectly acceptable. When you only have a small space to sleep in with a few hundred square feet on the roof for solar panels, your requirements dramatically change. In this case, the Bluetti RV5 easily wins on size, features, noise, and price. Even if you use your own 48-volt batteries instead of these, it's a much better solution than an EG4. Now on to these B4810 batteries. Remember, these are IP65 water resistant and heated, so you always have to pay a premium for that compared to a basic indoor server rack battery. They are currently listed at $16.99 on Bluetti's site. Amusingly enough, the 12-volt version here is $3.99, so multiply that times 4 for 48 volts. It actually works out to be $100 cheaper, or $1,600 if you go that route instead. Be aware, copper cable isn't free. You're going to spend some of that extra $100 on cabling the wire 4 batteries together instead of 1. Now, at $1,700, that battery is at quite a premium. It would be nice if they also offered a basic 48-volt battery for those camping below the Arctic Circle for under $1,000, but then again, I'm not the CEO. By far the best deal is going to be getting the RV5 and B4810 bundle for $27.99, as it saves $200. If we compare that bundle to Bluetti's flagship, the 3800 watt Apex 300 with 1 battery for 5.5 kilowatt hours of power, that's currently on sale for $23.99. I think the $400 premium for this is definitely worth it over the Apex if you prefer to have a permanent install in a mobile environment or small cabin. Also, if your RV, van, boat, bus, or whatever is considered a residence on your insurance, then a permanent install like this may qualify you for that 30% federal tax credit set to expire this year. Of course, you should check with your tax professional about that. Now, when I lived in my van down by the river, it was considered a residence, so I was able to take certain tax deductions that wouldn't normally qualify for a purely recreational vehicle. My old house right now is sitting in the bushes getting eaten by mice as I can't get it running again, and I bet that's the first time you ever heard that statement from somebody. I also remember that if you already own B300 series batteries or can find them on a steep discount somewhere, they will work perfectly fine with the RV5 hub as long as you get the adapter from Bluetti. All that adapter does is basically separate the 2 power lines and the data line, and then those 3 plug right into the RV5. This may be a way to cut costs if you don't need heated water-resistant batteries in your build. If you're interested, the link and any relevant discount codes are going to be in the description below. I'm also going to put a link here at the bottom of the screen, along with a QR code you can scan if you're watching me on TV, and take you on over to the Bluetti store page where you can check out the RV5 Power Hub and related accessories. Thanks for watching, and until next time.
Odin commands you to like and subscribe, and clean my litter box.